We have talked about language teaching methods from a historical perspective and explored the two traditions of the rationalist and the naturalistic approach to language teaching. Here we see a different way of arranging the different methods which have been tried over the course of time based on their fundamental assumption either about language or about language learning. Let's begin with the cognitive methods. These are various theories of how conscious learning works. This is all active, conscious, mental activity. The oldest of these was grammar translation, where students learned rules and then applied them in a deductive approach, and the dominant method of applying rules was through translation from L1 into L2 and L2 into L1. This was the dominant cognitive method all the way up until the late 1960s, when there was, for about 10 or 12 years, quite a bit of activity. Cognitive code was an adaptation which removed the translation from grammar translation, put in a somewhat more inductive way of approaching things, but still allowed students to be working consciously in terms of the target language and its rules. At the same time, in the 1970s, there was a theory out of Bulgaria from a very interesting scientist, scholar, and teacher called Georgi Losanov. His basic science was called suggestology, and his idea was that the human brain was capable of far more than we allow it, and what it was necessary to do was to desuggest to the learner any barriers that may be in the way of their full potential in this case, acquiring a second language. So to desuggest the anxiety, the thought that this was going to be difficult. And he had a number of interesting ways of trying to do that, including relaxation techniques, similar to yoga, the use of music, and providing large amounts of input to students in a way that they felt comfortable and they understood what was going on. The silent way was very different from Suggestopedia, because the theory was that our mind can work on really very small amounts of input data. And so the teacher would give one or at most two model sentences in the target language using very minimal context. They actually used colored blocks of different shapes and sizes. And then the teacher would step back and the students would work hard, again consciously, to produce more utterances along the lines of the model that was given. None of these three methods lasted particularly long. There were attempts to do research projects to support them, but none were particularly successful. And eventually, by 1990, what emerged was language awareness, the approach that we now recognize as most representative of the rationalist tradition, and in this case, the cognitive tradition, where the active mind works inductively, or in Van Leer's terms, abductively, working from authentic data to produce hypotheses about the way the target language systems function. Secondly, we can look at humanistic methods. These all came to the fore in the 1970s, and some of the ideas were borrowed from popular psychology and also from general education. So the basic view was that the learner is a whole person, not just a brain, but a person with interests and needs and emotions. And the idea of confluent education was that language education should be accompanied by grasping and learning new content, but also developing interpersonal skills and undergoing some sort of personal growth as well. And all these things were supposed to flow together. More specifically, going back to Suggestopedia, there were a couple of methods along humanistic lines which emerged. The Suggestopedia approach was to give learners an identity in the target language, usually someone of prestige. So students would be architects or lawyers or surgeons in their second language identity, and they would communicate with each other using that identity. And the idea was that being in such a role would give students confidence. This was not exactly, though, what most people had in mind when they talked about approaching the learner as a whole person. Community language learning was a way of turning over things to the students and allowing them to be responsible for the content of a lesson. Students would record an extended dialogue or conversation in the target language, helped by the teacher, who would be outside the circle as they formulated their utterances with the teacher's help and then pressed record and recorded them. So it would take, let's say, well over an hour to produce a 10 or 12 minute conversation. And they would then listen to that several times, transcribe it, and look at some of the language that had been produced in order to understand it. But they were very much speaking as themselves in a conversation on a topic that they were interested in. Thirdly, we can look at the behavioristic methods which emerged in the 40s and 50s. The principal one was the audiolingual method. The European adaptation of that was called the audiovisual method, and the British specific version of that was called the structural situational method. In all cases, structural linguistics was very much the basis. Language was sentences, sentences have patterns, and it's by mastering the various patterns in the target language that we develop proficiency and eventually fluency. It was also based on behaviorist psychology and the principles of massive practice, repetition developing good habits. So there were lots of repetition drills and manipulation drills of various kinds that caused people to produce utterances in the target language. There often was little context for this, however. The language was not necessarily meaningful, it certainly wasn't authentic. And it was eventually proved that learners did not develop particularly good proficiency using this, and also that they were often bored by the very repetitious nature of what was going on. One of the approaches that replaced behavioristic methods were comprehension-based methods. The idea that understanding precedes production. Listening and reading should come first. One good example was total physical response. Here, the students listen to commands issued by the teacher and respond with a physical movement. Sometimes this would be kinesthetic, so it would be a whole body response to stand up, turn around, sit down. Or there was a paper and pencil version, a more mechanical kind of response where students, for example, drew a picture following the instructions from the teacher. The natural approach went a little beyond total physical response by adding other elements, but it was essentially the same approach of lots of listening and the development of vocabulary and not paying formal attention to grammar. Older than those is the reading method, which arose in the 1920s and 1930s at the beginning of the information revolution, when in order to get access to the latest ideas, if you were a physicist, for example, you really needed to be able to read German. If you were a psychologist, you needed to be able to read Russian. The reading method surveys the target language grammar in L1 and then tackles examples, a series of graded reading. So you start with short, simple passages and you move up to more complex, and you simply read the text and answer some questions in L1 to make sure that you've understood. The idea was that that would eventually lead you to authentic texts, but unfortunately there always seemed to be a gap between the most difficult text that you got to in the course and then the real world. But the reading method remained prominent for a long time and was always required of, for example, PhD candidates in various fields, that they should demonstrate an understanding of subject matter in their field written in a second language. Finally, we come back to communicative methods, which have come to be the dominant paradigm in the last 30 years. And the direct method can have self-claim to communicativeness. Personally, I find that a lot of the direct method activities and the way they do things are not communicative because people are asking questions to which they know the answer, for example, and exchanging information that everybody in the room is very familiar with. So it comes down to communicative methodology where we try and create true communicative conditions through creating information gaps or opinion gaps, doing jigsaw reading and things like that. And then the question becomes, what is the syllabus? The syllabus is no longer grammatical as it was in the cognitive methods or the behaviorist methods. And so we have competing ideas. Is it task-based? Is the syllabus structured around different kinds of activity? Is it notional functional, which means it's based on meanings or speech acts, so that the syllabus has units called greeting, persuading, asking for directions, making requests, inviting, and so on? Or is it content-based? Do we in fact teach geography, history, popular culture, basic science and technology, and so forth in the target language, so that students' primary emphasis is on the content and only secondarily on the target language? So that's one way of looking at the development of language teaching methods. What was their basic assumption about language? Is it sentences? Is it discourse? Is it authentic? Is it inauthentic? And what is the basic idea about learning? Is it conscious and hard mental work? Is it more natural, based on a lot of listening and reading? Is it habit formation? Or is it engaging in communication?